Welcome back to Footnotes Folly. I am Pemberton. This is part 51. First, the aftermath of Plataea, the astonishing wealth of the Persian camp divided, the dedications to the gods, the grim punishment of the Thebans who had sided with the enemy. And then Herodotus carries us east, to the same day's other battle. The Greek fleet, lying off Samos, crosses to the Asian shore at Mycale, where the Persians have beached their ships and built a rampart. The Greeks storm it, the Ionians turn on their masters in the thick of the fight, and the victory lights the whole coast of Asia into revolt. The war that began with the burning of Sardes has come full circle. Let us continue.
When the Hellenes had buried their dead at Plataea, they immediately decided in common council to march against Thebes and demand that the Thebans surrender those who had taken the side of the Medes, especially Timogenides and Antigenos, who were leaders equal to the foremost men. If the Thebans did not give them up, they resolved not to withdraw from the city until they had captured it. Having made this decision, they came on the 11th day after the battle and began to besiege the Thebans, ordering them to give up the men. When the Thebans refused to surrender them, the Hellenes began to lay waste their land and also to attack their wall. Since they did not stop their ravages, on the 20th day Timogenides spoke to the Thebans. Thebans, since the Hellenes have resolved not to withdraw from the siege until either they have taken Thebes, or you have delivered us up to them, let the land of Boeotia suffer no more for our sake. If they desire money and are demanding our surrender only as a pretext for that, let us give them money taken from the treasury of the state, for we took the side of the Medes together with the state, and not by ourselves alone. But if they are truly carrying on the siege in order to get us into their hands, then we will give ourselves up for trial. It was thought that Timogenides had spoken very well and at the right time, and the Thebans immediately sent a herald to Pausanias, offering to deliver up the men. After they had made an agreement on these terms, Antigenos escaped from the city. When his sons were delivered to Pausanias, he released them from the charge, saying that the sons had no share in the guilt of taking the side of the Medes. As for the other men whom the Thebans delivered up, they supposed they would receive a trial, and they also trusted that they would be able to repel the danger by payment of money. But Pausanias, when he had received them, suspected this very thing. He first dismissed the whole army of allies, then took the men to Corinth and put them to death there. These were the things that happened at Plataea and at Thebes. Meanwhile, Artabazos the son of Pharnax, in his flight from Plataea, was by this time getting forward on his way. When he came to the Thessalians, they offered him hospitality and asked about the rest of the army, knowing nothing of what had happened at Plataea. Artabazos knew that if he told them the whole truth about the fighting, he would run the risk of being destroyed, both himself and the whole army with him, for he thought that, if they learned what had happened, they would all set upon him. Reflecting on this, he had told nothing of it to the Phocians, and now he spoke to the Thessalians. As you see, Thessalians, I am eager to march by the shortest way to Thracia. I am in great haste, since I have been sent with these men from the army for a certain business. Mardonios himself and his army should shortly be expected here, marching close behind me. Give him hospitality and show yourselves useful to him, for in the end you will not regret doing so. After saying this, Artabazos continued to march his army in haste through Thessaly and Macedonia straight toward Thracia, being truly eager to proceed and passing through the land by the shortest possible way. So he came to Byzantium, having left behind great numbers of his army, who had either been cut down by the Thracians on the way or overcome by hunger and fatigue. From Byzantium he crossed over in ships. Thus he himself made his return back to Asia. Now, on the same day on which the defeat took place at Plataea, another defeat also happened, as fortune would have it, at Mycale in Ionia. The Hellenes who had come in the ships with LibriTTS-R the Lacedaemonian were lying at Delos. Envoys then came to them from Samos, Lampon the son of Thrasicles, Athenagoras the son of Archestrides, and Hegesistratos the son of Aristagoras. They had been sent by the people of Samos without the knowledge either of the Persians or of the despot Theomester the son of Androdamas, whom the Persians had set up as despot of Samos. When these men were introduced before the commanders, Hegesistratos spoke at great length, using arguments of every kind. He said that as soon as the Ionians saw the Hellenes they would at once revolt from the Persians, and that the barbarians would not wait for the Hellenes' attack. If after all they did wait, he said, then the Hellenes would take such a prize as they would never take again afterward. Appealing to the gods worshipped in common, he tried to persuade them to rescue Hellenes from slavery and drive away the barbarian. This, he said, would be easy for them to do, because the enemy's ships sailed badly and were no match for them in battle. Moreover, if the Hellenes suspected that the Samians were trying to lead them on by fraud, the Samians were ready to be taken as hostages in their ships. As the stranger from Samos was urgent in his prayer, LibriTTS-R asked him a question, either because he wished to hear the answer for the sake of the omen, or perhaps by a chance brought about by Providence. He asked the stranger of Samos what his name was. The man said that it was Hegesistratos. LibriTTS-R cut short the rest of his speech, stopping all that Hegesistratos had still intended to say, and declared that he accepted the augury given in the name Hegesistratos. He told the stranger of Samos to see, on his part, that he and the men with him gave assurance that the Samians would without fail be zealous allies of the Hellenes, and after that to sail away home. Thus he spoke, and to the words he added the deed, for immediately the Samians gave assurance and made oaths of alliance with the Hellenes. After they had done this, the others sailed away home, but LibriTTS ordered Herodotus to sail with the Hellenes, considering his name an omen of good success. Then the Hellenes, after staying still that day, offered sacrifices for success on the next day. Their diviner was Tephonos the son of Euenios, and Apollonia from that Apollonia which lies in the Ionian Gulf. To this man's father Euenios the following happened. At Apollonia there are sheep sacred to the sun. During the day they feed by a river running from Mount Lachman through the land of Apollonia to the sea by the harbor of Oricus. By night they are watched by men chosen for this purpose, the citizens most highly regarded for wealth and noble birth, each man having charge of them for a year. The people of Apollonia set great value on these sheep because of an oracle, and they are folded in a cave at some distance from the city. At the time of which I speak, Euenios was keeping watch over them, having been chosen for that purpose. One night he fell asleep during his watch, and wolves came into the cave and killed about 60 of the sheep. When he realized this, he kept it secret and told no one, intending to buy others and substitute them in place of those that had been killed. But the people of Apollonia discovered what had happened. When they were informed of it, they brought him before a court and condemned him to be deprived of his eyesight for having fallen asleep during his watch. But after they had blinded Euenios, their flocks immediately stopped bearing young and their lands stopped producing crops as before. When they asked the prophets the cause of the evil they were suffering, prophecies were given to them both at Dodona and at Delphi. The prophets told them that they had acted unjustly in depriving Euenios, the watcher of the sacred sheep, of his sight. The gods whom they had consulted had themselves sent the wolves to attack the sheep, and they would not cease taking vengeance for him until the men of Apollonia paid Euenios whatever satisfaction he himself should choose and deem sufficient. When this was fulfilled, the gods would give Euenios a gift of such a kind that many men would think him happy because he possessed it. These oracles were given to them, and the people of Apollonia kept the matter secret, assigning certain citizens to manage the affair. They handled it in this way. When Euenios was sitting on a public seat, they came and sat beside him, talked about other matters, and at last began to express sympathy for his misfortune. Leading him on in this way, they asked what satisfaction he would choose if the people of Apollonia undertook to compensate him for what they had done. Since he had not heard the oracle, he chose and said that if the lands belonging to certain citizens were given to him, naming those whom he knew to possess the 2 best lots of land in Apollonia, and if along with these he were given a dwelling house that he knew to be the best house in the city, then, if he became the owner of these, he would have no anger against them in the future, and this compensation would be enough for him if it were given. While he was saying this, the men sitting beside him interrupted, and said that this was the satisfaction the Apolloniates were paying him for his blinding in accordance with the oracles given to them. At this he was angry, being thus informed of the whole matter and thinking that he had been deceived. They bought the property from those who owned it, and gave him what he had chosen. Immediately after this he had a natural gift of divination, so that he became very famous. Tephonos, then, was the son of the Euenios, and he was acting as diviner for the army, having been brought by the Corinthians. I have also heard, however, that Tephonos wrongly made use of the name of Euenios and undertook work of this kind around Hellas, though he was not really the son of Euenios. When the sacrifices proved favorable to the Hellenes, they put their ships to sea from Delos to go to Samos. After arriving off Kalamissa and Samos, they moored their ships there opposite the temple of Hera, at that place, and made preparations for a sea fight. But the Persians, when they learned that the Hellenes were sailing there, also put out to sea and went over to the mainland with their remaining ships, since the ships of the Phoenicians had already been sent away to sail home. After deliberating, they thought it best not to fight a battle by sea, since they did not think they were a match for the enemy. They sailed away to the mainland so that they might be under the protection of their land army at Mycale, a body that had stayed behind the rest of the army by command of Xerxes and was keeping watch over Ionia. Its number was 60,000, and its commander was Tigris, who surpassed the other Persians in beauty and stature. The commanders of the fleet had decided to take refuge under the protection of this army, draw up their ships on shore, and put an enclosure around them as protection for the ships and a refuge for themselves. Having decided this, they began to put out to sea. They came along by the temple of the revered goddesses to the Gaison and to Scolopes in Mycale, where there is a temple of the Eleusinian Demeter, which Philistos the son of Pasicles built when he accompanied Neleus the son of Cadros for the founding of Mytos. There they drew up their ships on shore and put an enclosure around them of stones and timber, cutting down trees for this purpose. They fixed stakes around the enclosure and made their preparations either for being besieged or for gaining a victory, for in making their preparations they reckoned on both possibilities. When the Hellenes learned that the barbarians had gone away to the mainland, they were vexed, because they thought the enemy had escaped. They were uncertain what they should do, whether to go back home or sail down toward the Hellespont. At last they resolved to do neither of these things, but to sail on to the mainland. Therefore, after they had prepared boarding, bridges and everything else needed for a sea fight, they sailed toward Mycale. When they came near the camp, and saw that no one was putting out against them, but perceived ships drawn up inside the wall, and a large land army ranged along the shore, LibriTTS first sailed along in his ship as close to the shore as he could, and made a proclamation to the Ionians through a herald. Ionians, those of you who happen to be within hearing of me, pay attention to what I say, for the Persians will not understand anything of what I command you. When we join battle, each of you must remember first the freedom of all, and then the watchword Heb. Let the man who has not heard this learn it from the man who has." The purpose of this act was the same as that of Themistocles and Artemision. Either the words spoken would escape the knowledge of the barbarians and persuade the Ionians, or they would be reported to the barbarians and make them distrustful of the Hellenes. After LibriTTS had made this suggestion, the Hellenes next brought their ships up to land and disembarked on the shore. They began arranging themselves for battle. When the Persians saw that the Hellenes were preparing to fight and also that they had given exhortation to the Ionians, they first took away the arms of the Samians, suspecting them of leaning toward the Hellenic side. Their suspicion came especially from this, when the Athenian prisoners, the men whom the army of Xerxes had found left behind in Attica, had come in the ships of the barbarians. The Samians had ransomed them and sent them back to Athens, supplying them with means for the journey. For this reason above all they were suspected, since they had ransomed 500 enemies of Xerxes. Secondly, the Persians appointed the Milesians to guard the passes that lead to the summits of Mycale, on the pretext that they knew the country best, but the true reason was to keep them out of the camp. In this way the Persians tried to secure themselves against those Ionians whom they suspected would make some hostile move if they found the opportunity. Then the Persians themselves brought together their wicker shields to serve as a fence. When the Hellenes had made all their preparations, they advanced to attack the barbarians. As they went, a rumor suddenly came through their whole army, and at the same time a herald's staff was found lying on the beach. The rumor that spread through the army was that the Hellenes were fighting in Boeotia and were defeating the army of Mardonios. Divine power is seen in earthly things by many signs, and among them by this. On the very day when the defeat at Plataea and the battle that was about to happen at Mycale fell together, a rumor came to the Hellenes here, so that the army was much more encouraged and much more eager to face the danger. Another coincidence also happened. A sacred enclosure of the Eleusinian Demeter stood close beside both battlefields. Not only had the fight in the Plataean land taken place beside the temple of Demeter, as I have said before, but at Mycale it was to be so likewise. The rumor that came to them, saying that victory had already been gained by the Hellenes with Pausanias, proved true. What was done at Plataea happened early in the morning, while the fighting at Mycale took place in the afternoon. Not long afterward, when they inquired into the matter, it became clear to them that both battles happened on the same day of the same month. Before the rumor arrived, they had been afraid, not so much for themselves as for the Hellenes generally, lest Hellas should stumble and fall over Mardonios. But when this report suddenly came to them, they advanced against the enemy much more vigorously and swiftly than before. Thus the Hellenes and the barbarians went eagerly into battle, since both the islands and the Hellespont lay before them as prizes of the contest. For the Athenians and those ranged next to them, numbering perhaps half the whole army, the road lay along the sea beach and over level ground. But the Lacedaemonians and those ordered with them were forced to go by a ravine and along the mountainside. So, while the Lacedaemonians were still going around, those on the other wing were already beginning the fight. As long as the wicker shields of the Persians still stood upright, they continued to defend themselves, and had rather the advantage in the battle. The troops of the Athenians, and of those ranged next to them, wanted the achievement to belong to them and not to the Lacedaemonians, and with exhortations to one another they set themselves more vigorously to the work. From that time the fortune of the fight changed. They pushed aside the wicker shields and fell upon the Persians with a rush, all in one body. The Persians withstood their first attack and continued defending themselves for a long time, but at last they fled to the wall. The Athenians, Corinthians, Sicyonians, and Troezenians, for that was the order in which they were ranged, followed close after them and rushed in together with them into the space inside the wall. When the wall too had been captured, the barbarians no longer took to resistance, but at once began to flee, except only the Persians. These formed themselves into small groups and continued to fight with the Hellenes as they rushed inside the wall. Of the commanders of the Persians, 2 escaped and 2 were slain. Artanes and Ithameters, commanders of the fleet, escaped, while Mardons and Tigranes, the commander of the land army, were slain. While the Persians were still fighting, the Lacedaemonians and those with them arrived and joined in carrying through the rest of the work. Many of the Hellenes themselves fell there, and especially many of the Sicyonians, together with their commander Perlaus. The Samians who were serving in the army, being in the camp of the Medes and having been deprived of their arms, saw that from the very beginning the battle was becoming doubtful, and they did as much as they could, trying to give assistance to the Hellenes. When the other Ionians saw that the Samians had set the example, they too revolted from the Persians and attacked the barbarians. The Milesians also had been appointed to guard the passes for the Persians in order to secure their safety, so that if what actually happened should come upon them after all, they might have guides and get safely away to the summits of Mycale. The Milesians, I say, had been appointed to do this not only for that purpose, but also from fear that, if they were present in the camp, they might make some hostile move. But in fact they did the opposite of what they had been appointed to do. They not only directed the fleeing Persians by the wrong paths that led toward the enemy, but at last they themselves became their worst foes and began to kill them. Thus Ionia revolted from the Persians for the second time. In this battle, among the Hellenes, the Athenians were the best men, and among the Athenians the best was Hermolykos the son of Euthynos, a man who had trained for the pancration. After these events, when there was war between the Athenians and the Charistans, this Hermolycos was killed in battle at Chinos in the Charistian land near Gerastos, and he was buried there. After the Athenians, the Corinthians, Troezenians, and Sicyonians were the best. When the Hellenes had slain the greater number of the barbarians, some in the battle and others in their flight, they set fire to the ships and to the whole wall, after first bringing the spoil out to the seashore. Among the rest they found stores of money. So, having burned the wall and the ships, they sailed away. When they came to Samos, the Hellenes deliberated about removing the inhabitants of Ionia and considered where they ought to settle them in those parts of Hellas that they controlled, leaving Ionia to the barbarians. It was clear to them that, on the one hand, it was impossible for them to be always stationed as guards to protect the Ionians, and on the other, if they were not stationed there to protect them, they had no hope that the Ionians would escape the Persians unpunished. Therefore it seemed good to the Peloponnesian leaders that they should remove the inhabitants of the trading ports belonging to those peoples of Hellas who had taken the side of the Medes, and give that land to the Ionians to live in. But the Athenians did not think it good that the inhabitants of Ionia should be removed at all, nor that the Peloponnesians should consult about Athenian colonies. Since the Athenians strongly resisted the proposal, the Peloponnesians gave way. The result was that they admitted to their alliance the Samians, Chians, Lesbians, and the other islanders who happened to be serving with the Hellenes, binding them by pledges and oaths to remain faithful and not withdraw from the league. After binding these by oaths, they sailed to break up the bridges, for they supposed they would find them still stretched over the straits. These men then were sailing toward the Hellespont. Meanwhile, the barbarians who had escaped and had been driven to the heights of Mycale, not many in number, were making their way to Sardes. As they went, Macis the son of Darius, who had been present at the disaster that had befallen them, said many evil things about the commander Artanes. Among other things, he said that in respect of the generalship he had shown, Artanes was worse than a woman, and that he deserved every kind of evil for having brought evil upon the house of the king. Among the Persians, to be called worse than a woman is the greatest possible reproach. After Artanes had been much reviled, he finally became angry and drew his sword against Macis, intending to kill him. As he was running at him, Xenagorus the son of Praxilaus, a man of Halicarnassos, who was standing just behind Artanes, perceived what was happening. He seized Artanes around the middle, lifted him up, and dashed him to the ground. Meanwhile, the spearmen of Macis came forward to protect him. Thus Xenagorus acted, and in doing so he laid up gratitude for himself both with Macis and with Xerxes, because he had saved the life of the king's brother. For this deed Xenagorus became ruler of all Cilicia by the gift of the king. Nothing further happened as they went on their way, and they arrived at Sardes. Now at Sardes, as it happened, King Xerxes had been staying ever since the time when he came there in flight from Athens after suffering defeat in the sea fight.
And we will stop there, with the Persians driven from the sea and the Greeks of Asia in revolt, the long war all but over. Next time, in the very last part of the series, part 52, a dark and terrible story from inside Xerxes' own house, the taking of the last Persian foothold in Europe at Sestos, and the words with which Herodotus chooses to close his whole history. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.